Well, my name's Bruce Firestone. I'm the founder of the Ottawa Senators and the executive director of Exploring.org, and I'm also a prof at the University of Ottawa, the Telford School of Management.
Excellent. Just to ease into questions a little bit,
Yeah.
how do you feel about the current Ottawa Senators?
Well, I think the current Senators are a hardworking team. They've obviously had some significant injuries, and we'll see what the future brings. But right now, they're in a playoff position. That's pretty good.
Absolutely. Can you tell me a little bit about your background before you became involved with the Ottawa Senators?
Well, I've been a professor, a real estate guy. I'm a novelist, a writer. I've done a lot of different things, and certainly being a hockey guy or hockey executive was one of the highlights of my career.
Okay. How did the original idea for putting in an expansion bid for Ottawa come to you?
Well, it was in the days before cell phones, so the only place really to get peace and quiet, even in that day, in that time, late 80s, I guess, was to get in my car, which was a Saab, and drive up and down the Queensway here in Ottawa. And one time I was doing that, and I thought, we should try and do something new and different. And I thought, what would that be? And I asked myself the question, what does Toronto have that we don't have here in Ottawa? And they have, a theater, they have a zoo. I'm not that interested in animals. And so I thought, what could we do in Ottawa? I thought, well, they have an NHL team. And I said, well, maybe we could get one for Ottawa. And if we do, maybe our company should be the bidder.
When you say we, who is we?
Well, it was Terrace Investments Limited, which was the first parent company of the Ottawa Senators, and it was a core group of individuals led by myself, together with Cyril Leader, who's the president of the Ottawa Senators now today, in 2013, and Randy Sexton, who's with the Pittsburgh Penguins, and a really great group of young executives.
Okay. What was the first off, when did you first suggest to them that you were going to do this?
Well, I remember we used to play hockey, just recreational hockey. And after one game at the old Lions Arena here in Ottawa, I said to Cyril and Randy, just hang back and let's spend a few minutes after everybody leaves and in the locker room as we're getting changed. I said, Cyril, Randy, I think the NHL is getting ready to expand. And they said, wow, that's really interesting. And I said, I think Ottawa's big enough to have an NHL team. Okay, they said, that's interesting. And I said, and if they do expand and Ottawa's big enough for a team, we ought to go after one with Terrace Investments Limited. And Randy Sexton right away got up and said, yeah, let's do it. I mean, he's an MBA from Clarkson and a hockey guy, and he was really super enthusiastic. But Cyril's a little bit more cautious, and he's a CA, chartered accountant, and he said, well, wait a second, how much is this going to cost?
Okay. What was the first step in entering a bid with the NHL?
Well, we felt, because we were a real estate company, the first step is to get a site where we could build a new building. And we looked at a number of locations in Ottawa, some of them downtown, some of them in the east end of Ottawa, some in what was Hull, Quebec, now Gatineau, Quebec, and one location where Scotiabank Place is today, which is in the west end of Ottawa.
Okay. What were some steps you made to make your bid attractive to the NHL?
Well, first of all, you have to recognize it's a small club of about, in that time, 21 teams. And I thought it was pretty important to meet with each of the owners and the president of the National Hockey League. The president of the National Hockey League was John Ziegler. And so I went down to New York and I met with John, and then I went and did a tour of NHL cities and introduced myself and told them all kinds of things about me and about Terrace and about Ottawa. And we felt it was a little bit like trying to be mayor of a city, only instead of having to go after thousands or tens of thousands of voters, you're really after 21 or 22.
Okay. What kind of an impact did Cyril Leader and Randy Sexton specifically have?
Well, I always say to Cyril that the bid book, I wish I had a copy of it here to show you, and I think I might after this interview is done. The bid book is about this thick, and I said to Cyril, that's your PhD thesis. So Cyril wrote the bid book, and Randy was very, very important to the overall success. He was relentless. He went with me to most of the NHL cities that I visited, met with the owners as I did, and just was relentless. We had a core group of about 30 people involved in the bid, and when we actually presented to the National Hockey League, we had myself, Cyril Leader, Randy Sexton, Jim Durrell, who was mayor of the city of Ottawa at the time. We had Elliot Richardson, former Attorney General of the United States, as our legal representative, and we had Gary Burns from our accounting firm.
Okay. What was when did you first announce your intentions to do this to the city of Ottawa, and what was the reaction?
Well, I think the announcement came in, I think, 1990. So we had been thinking about it from 1987 to 1990. We had been buying some land, about 600 acres of land in Canada, which is now part of Ottawa. And so we announced it to the community, and right away there was both surprise, delight, and skepticism.
Why did you decide to use the Senators' name?
I get the question. I get that question quite often, and you know, the Ottawa Senators have a great history in the National Hockey League. They won 9 Stanley Cups, although there's some debate that there might be a couple more, so maybe they won 11. And it has a great history and tradition. I knew Frank Finnegan, who played for the Ottawa Senators back in the 1920s, and I think scored in one of the Stanley Cup winning games. And you know, it's a tremendous name, and for some people, you know, the Senate in Ottawa perhaps is not the best name for the team, but the history made a difference to me. And of course, the Senate doesn't just refer to the Canadian Senate; it refers to the Senate in Rome and many other images that you see that we use today.
First off, give us a better idea of who Frank Finnegan was and what he meant to this bid.
Well, he was a wonderful proponent of our bid. He actually came with us, and he was quite elderly. He came with us to Palm Beach, and I remember the night before we actually got the team, Mr. Finnegan, with his large hockey hands, he still had the big hockey hands, even though I think he was late 80s, early 90s. He said to Mr. Ziegler, "Now you be sure to give those boys in Ottawa a fair shake, Mr. Ziegler." And John said, of course, he would do that, and he was terrific, really helpful to us, Giovanni.
What was the process between starting the bid and, this is kind of broad, starting the bid and winning the franchise? Give us the behind the scenes, basically.
Well, there was a moment of great angst, I think, for our group. When the NHL was about to announce the winning bids, they took us, NHL security took us in this old hotel that we were in to the basement, and we were there in the breakers in Palm Beach, in the basement. You know, there was garbage all over the place, the pipes were leaking on us, and the prep kitchen was down there, and I looked around, and there was our team, our bid team, you know, Mr. Durrell, myself, Elliot Richardson, Gary Burns, Cyril, and Randy, and I said, "Whoa, this doesn't look very good." But what we didn't know was that the losers were actually upstairs, where the media could kind of get at them, and the winners were being hidden downstairs. But at that time, it didn't kind of occur to me that that was the case. So I said to the group, said, "It doesn't look very good. If we haven't been successful, we'll thank the National Hockey League for the opportunity to be a bidder. And then we'll have our own press conference, and in a true Canadian kind of fashion, we'll say, well, we weren't successful today, but there'll be another winter meeting next year, and we're going to come back."
Describe what happened after what you just said and to when it was announced that you had won the team.
Well, finally we were brought up from the basement of the Breakers Hotel to where the National Hockey League's Board of Governors was meeting, and we went into that conference room, and there are all the governors, and Marcel Lebeau came up to me. He was the owner of the Quebec Nordiques, which have now become the Avalanche. And he came up to me and said, "Félicitations, mon ami," and gave me a big hug and a handshake, and I thought he was congratulating us for a good try. And then I go to the front of the room, and there's John Ziegler and Phil Esposito, who was fronting the Tampa Bay bid. And there on a piece of paper in front of me, it said, "The NHL is pleased and proud to announce today conditional memberships have been awarded to the franchises of Ottawa and Tampa." And that was the moment when we knew we actually had won. It was a wonderful moment. I think Randy must have had a 3-foot vertical jump. He was pretty excited, and Cyril was excited, our whole team was excited, and it was a great moment.
Describe to me any roadblocks you had along the way, just anything you have.
Well, there's one that of course you've heard about. You know, young people in this room perhaps don't know the story, but you know, the next day when we came back to Ottawa, you know, Phil Esposito called me from Tampa, and he said, "Just had a great call from the governor of the state of Florida." I said, "Oh, well, tell me what was said." And he said, "Congratulations on bringing the NHL to Florida. This is a great moment, and we're looking forward to working with you to develop a new building in Tampa." Because they needed a new building too. And so Phil said, "How was the reaction back in Ontario?" And I said, "Well, we didn't get a call from the Premier of the province of Ontario, Mr. Ray, congratulating us. We got a lawsuit instead from the government of Ontario. They were opposed to us building the Palladium or Scotiabank Place, and so they took us to the Ontario Municipal Board. We had a 13-and-a-half-week hearing. It's pretty grueling. I was on the stand for 3.5 days, and so, you know, in Florida there was a lot of support, and in Ontario, obviously, not quite the support we expected."
What would have been the alternative if if that lawsuit had failed? Or like you had failed in that lawsuit?
Well, if we certainly, there were three main conditions, Giovanni, that we had to fulfill. We had to pay the franchise fee, we had to sell a minimum of 10,000 season tickets, and we also had to make significant progress on an NHL caliber arena. Because we had planned to play in the Civic Center downtown Ottawa for the first few years, which we did. But it's only a 10,000 seat arena, and that just isn't going to work long term. So had we failed on that, we'd be cheering for the Senators, but they'd be playing probably in Anaheim.
Would you say that was your lowest moment, or was there any other really?
Oh, that's by far the toughest moment that we faced. We didn't know if we were going to win that hearing or not. I mean, it's a significant investment in time and money and effort. I think we spent about $2.5 million of our money on legal and planning, costs for that hearing, and and out of that hearing, we did get approval, thankfully, for Scotiabank Place and the 100 acres for that. But the other 500 acres that we were hoping to develop as well, we didn't get approval for that. And we also had to build the Palladium interchange. If you go out to Scotiabank Place, there's an interchange there built with private money. And I still think to this day it's the only interchange in Ontario built by the private sector. That was about a $30 million cost. So there were a lot of negatives that came out of the hearing, but the positive is that we got the most important thing, which was Scotiabank Place.
Were there people that were around saying this can't be done, this is impossible in Ottawa?
Well, I don't know that it's an Ottawa thing. It may be a Canadian issue. Canadians do some really fine work in technology, and we have a peaceful, largely peaceful nation, and if two Canadians get into an argument, probably the worst that will happen is they might exchange harsh language. We don't tend to shoot each other very often. Here in Ottawa, we have a murder rate of maybe 10 or 11 or 12 people a year. That's 10 or 11 or 12 too many. But when I was visiting Detroit, Mike Ilitch, who owns the Detroit Red Wings, he asked me what the murder rate is in Ottawa, and I told him. And he said, is that a day? And I said, no, Mike, that's a year. And of course, in Detroit, they would have a murder rate, in the thousands. So, we do a lot of things very well in Canada. We have, I think, our priorities largely right. But one of the things that we're not as good at as the Americans tend to be is to promote ourselves and to have confidence in ourselves. And I see that a lot in Canadians.
Okay, I have a quote that I have from around the time.
Sure.
Not my opinion. Alan Eagleson, who was the head of the NHL Players Association,
right.
said, quote, Bruce Firestone is leading fans to the Petunia Peach if he thinks that he can land a franchise in Ottawa now or any other time. What was the reaction? We'll quote that.
Well, Alan has a colorful history. I don't know if you know his history, but it's colorful to say the least. And whenever you do something, you will get criticism. The only way you can avoid criticism is if you don't do anything. So, we had our critics for sure, but you tend to develop a thick skin or deal with these kinds of comments, and really you have to consider the source.
What happened another broad question? What happened between the day the franchise was granted and opening night?
Well, we had the Palladium hearing at the Ontario Municipal Board. We raised $85 million for the team, and then subsequently raised another $240 million to build that building, and $30 million to build that interchange. So we were really busy, and to do the things that we had to do and we needed to do during a tough recession. You're too young to know this, but that period of time in Canadian history was quite a difficult and challenging time. We had the Government of Canada cutting back in many ways. We had a tough recession going on. There was an even more difficult circumstance here in Ottawa, because if the federal government cuts employees, Ottawa disproportionately will feel that. So it was quite challenging, and we had a group though that just wouldn't give up. Okay,
mark that down, Becca. Describe to me the emotion of opening night.
Well, I'm really glad you asked that. I get kind of chills when I think about it, and I try not to think about it too often because, I've got to go on with my life and do new things. But I remember standing on the ice on opening night, and the arena could only hold 10,000 people. I bet you we had 12,000 people there. And And I remember the team coming out, and I knew it was going to be a difficult first year. Our expansion franchise and our draft was not an easy draft, and I thought we would really struggle to get points. And one of the players told me, it's not that we're a bad team, it's just that we play in a really, really good league. And I thought that was a pretty good comment for the year, and it was. But standing there, the fans in Ottawa and the fans in that building that night gave the team about a 5 or 6 minute standing ovation, which is a long time. And I was standing there, and it just went on and on and on. And I realized that the fans in that building and the community weren't really applauding the team or me or anybody else. They were applauding themselves. It was the fact that I feel that the community felt, particularly at that time, that we have come together to do this together. It was a great moment.
Excellent. I've seen video footage of the opening ceremony that night. Tell me what you felt when all those festivities were going on.
Well, there was one, I think Brian Orser was skating in the opening, and he was told over and over and over again not to do that incredible backflip that he does. He skates along, turns backwards, does a complete flip in the air. And, he was told not to do that. It was too dangerous. And, if you've ever worked with artists, you realize artists don't necessarily pay a lot of attention to what they're told not to do. And so, sure enough, he did that backflip. The fans went crazy. It was a wonderful moment. And I had to laugh when I saw him do that because, it's so typical of entrepreneurs when they're told no.
Going back through this entire process, did you ever have any self-doubts when you didn't think it was going to work?
I don't think so. You can't really try and lead a group of people if you're constantly questioning yourself. I mean, there are definitely moments that were low moments, and there were moments that were very high moments. But there was never a moment, I can't remember or recall ever a moment where I said, "Oh, we should give up." That wasn't going to happen.
If you haven't told me them already, can you just tell me a little more detail on some of those low moments and some of those high moments?
Well, the high moment I did tell you about was the actual, the grant of the franchise. That was a wonderful moment, and of course, the first game. Another high moment was our first draft, and there were two players. I think Hammerlick and Yashin, who were ranked either 1, 2, or 2 and 1. And John Ferguson Sr. was our director of player personnel. And it's the only hockey decision I ever made. And because we didn't know who we should pick. Should we pick Hammerlick or should we pick Yashin? And John Ferguson, with those Stanley Cup rings on, I don't know how many Stanley Cups he had won with the Montreal Canadiens, but a bunch. He was, with those big hockey hands and the Stanley Cup rings, he said, "We're drafting Yashin whether we win the coin toss and we choose first, or Tampa chooses first." And but some people wanted Hammerlick, and I said, "Look, that's it. Mr. Ziegler's called us. It's time. It's noon. We have to go flip a coin and make a decision. We're going to draft Yashin." Everybody looks at me like, "What do you know about drafting hockey players?" Frankly, not very much. But I said, "Look, we've hired John as our director of player personnel. He knows two things: hockey players and horses. He liked horses, and so if he says it's Yashin, it's Yashin."
How did you feel during the season, the opening season?
Well, I was okay. There would be, like a month would go by, we wouldn't get a point, or we'd get 1 point, or 2 or 3. So I think we got 24 points for the whole season. One of the worst records ever. Fortunately, not the worst. I think the worst is the Washington Capitals in the early 70s. But there were whole months where we would get very few wins and points. And it didn't really affect me. I would come into the office and I'd see everybody, slumped like this, body language was very negative. And I would get everybody together every couple of months and I would say, only one team wins the Stanley Cup every year. And whether you get 30 points or you get 80 points or you get 100 points, it doesn't really matter. It only matters who wins the Stanley Cup. And maybe we're not going to make the playoffs this year. I think we were 60 points out. And maybe we're not, Stanley Cup winners now. Hopefully one day we will be. But there are all these other teams who aren't either. And you still have to do your job. So if you're working for the Chicago Blackhawks, who hadn't won a Stanley Cup forever, or the Toronto Maple Leafs or any of the other great franchises, they don't win the Stanley Cup every year either, and they end up losing. So we have to keep going. So could everybody stop reading the newspapers? And the media attention was quite negative at that point. I said, just stop reading if it's upsetting, because you have to do your job.
Okay. How do you feel that the city of Ottawa stood by you during that tough first season?
I think the fans were terrific. Maybe the media were very critical, because we had talked to Sam Pollock, who built the Montreal Canadiens dynasty of the 70s, I think, and we had talked to Bill Torrey, who had built the New York Islanders dynasty, and we talked to Glenn Sather, who had built the Oilers dynasty in the 80s. And all three of them said the same thing, that you cannot build a competitive team, a team that could contend for the Stanley Cup anyway but through the draft. You're going to make some trades, but you can't be Trader Vic. You can't be trading. And, Phil Esposito was able to, maybe he did a better job at the draft. He certainly did engage in lots of trades. And so Tampa Bay became, a decent middle-of-the-road team very quickly. Ottawa did not. We wanted to build through the draft. So if you look at the different, paths we took, we got a lot of criticism that our strategy was out of date. It was based on people who were over the hill, whether they're talking about Bill Torrey or Sam Pollock or Glenn Sather for that matter. And we didn't agree with that. And so we pursued a strategy. The fans bought that, but I don't think the media did.
So you would say the media was a bit too harsh?
Well, I can't say that. I mean, that's what they do, right? It can be quite critical. But, you cannot let the fans, for all that, even though they put their hard-earned money down, you can't let the fans or the media run your franchise. If you're a general manager in the National League, you have to have a plan. You can see that NHL teams that don't have a plan end up last or close to last and mediocre for very long periods of time. You need to have a plan.
Okay. Tell me how it came about that you left the team.
Well, we had two bosses, two cooks in the kitchen. Rod Brydon, if you know anything about Rod Brydon, is is an alpha guy, and he clearly tends to want to run the things that he's involved with, and he's a very talented executive. And I think Rod and I realized after that first year that one of us was going to leave, and he didn't want it to be him. So I didn't want to leave, but on the other hand, I understood that you have to have one controlling mind and one voice at the top and not two. And I said I can go on and do other things. I can go back to teaching, which I did at Carleton University School of Architecture, and then later on at the Telfer School of Management at the University of Ottawa. And I can do some other things, and I was okay to do that.
What effect would you say that this has had on your lifelong term, the Senators?
Well, I think that it's had obviously a huge impact on me personally, but I think that, other than doing this interview here and a few, they trot me out to do the PR thing once in a while, like the Queen of England, and I do the wave. I really don't spend a lot of time on the past, and I think that's probably what you need to do as an entrepreneur. If you live in the past, you will get old fast. So I tend to live in the present and with a hopeful view to the future. And apart from spending some time with students like you and some others, I don't spend a lot of time reminiscing, maybe once a year on the anniversary of the grant of the franchise.
Okay. How did it feel when you saw the Palladium starting to be built?
Well, that was great. I mean, whenever, there would be some moment in my life where I needed a jolt of energy and encouragement, I'd go out and watch that building coming out of the ground. And there were 4 tower cranes. They built that building in 4 quadrants, and they built it faster. It was much faster to build than it was to plan and finance. It took us to get OMB approval and planning approvals. I can't remember, but I think there were 185 individual organizations that needed to sign off before we could actually build that thing, and it took about 5 years. So it took about 5 years to get it approved, and took about 28 to 30 months to build.
Was the original plan for it very different looking than what we see today?
Yeah, we hired Gino Rossetti, the architect for the Palace of Auburn Hills in Detroit, and Gino had revolutionized arena design. He was the one who said, why don't we take, say, Opera House design and apply it to these new buildings? And so instead of having a ring of suites at the top where the people who pay the most money are the furthest from the action or the court or the ice surface, why don't we have, consecutive rings, three of them, one very close. And that does a few things. It changes the economics of arena construction because you have some fixed income coming in from those suite rentals. It also brings the building into a smaller space because you have these balconies that are being in effect created by those rings of suites. So you get a smaller space, more intimate space, a better viewing experience. So, he really revolutionized arena design, and we wanted Gino to design our building. And so we brought him here from Detroit, and he loved the site, and he's done a great job with that building. But it did evolve. We added some innovation to it. For example, if you think about Scotiabank Place, half that building is in the ground and half of it's, out of the ground. So it's more human scale than just if it was just like Madison Square Garden built up from grade, and in fact above grade. So the other thing we did was, because we were at grade in terms of our entrance, you could have things like restaurants and retail spaces that are double loaded, that face out to the street as well as face into the building. So we did some neat stuff, and Gino was wonderful to work with.
Okay. What was opening night like at the Palladium?
Well, I think Bryan Adams came to play, great Canadian rocker, and that was so much fun for everybody, and that was kind of the night before. And then the actual night itself was magical. It probably didn't quite match the opening night of the Civic Center, but it was really exciting.
Okay. Can you tell me a little bit more about what the emotions were for you and the fans that night?
Well, I thought that the building of the Palladium, Scotiabank Place, would cement the Senators in Ottawa for another generation. And you've got to remember that era, the Canadian dollar had gone from 80 or 90 cents when we bought the franchise to, I think, 62 or 63 cents. And payroll had gone from about 6.5 million Canadian dollars to about 45 or 50 million US dollars, paid for with 63 or 64 cent Canadian dollars. So it would be pretty hard to run any business with that kind of acceleration in labor cost. So I think that we felt, unless we could move from a 10,000 seat arena to a 20,000 seat arena with all the sponsorship opportunities and signage opportunities and other revenue opportunities, we would not be successful. So it was a great feeling of accomplishment, but more of a feeling of relief than joy.
When do you feel that the Senators sort of came of age as a franchise?
That's a really good question. There's no doubt in my mind there's one moment, that's a really good question. There's one moment I think that encapsulates that for me. And it was, I think it was the last game of the season. Jacques Martin was our coach at the time. And we were playing maybe the best goaltender of all time, but certainly one of the best, Dominic Hasek. He was playing for the Buffalo Sabres. And we had said to our fans, look, stick with us. We have a 7 to 12 year plan. Our plan is to build through the draft and challenge for the Stanley Cup within 7 to 12 years and make the playoffs in year 5. This was year 5. And our last game of the season, it was win and in the playoffs, lose and you're out. We're playing the best goaltender in the world at the time. And it's 0-0 with about 6 or 7 minutes remaining. If we tie, we miss the playoffs. We have to win. Dominic Hasek was unbelievable. And I remember turning to my mom and saying, my mom was alive then. I said, Mom, I don't know what's going to happen. When you're in a bit stressed out, you turn to your mother, right? And she said, don't worry, Bruce, they're going to score. And sure enough, within a couple of minutes of that, Yashin had the puck on the half boards, and he passed it out to Steve Duchesne skating in. And Steve put a perfect shot past Hasek. And the last 3 or 4 minutes of that game with the fans, unbelievable, standing up and shouting and screaming. It was unbelievable that it looked like we could make the playoffs, and of course we did.
Are there any moments you would like to take back and do over again if you could have the experience, change it up?
Well, I don't think I've ever been asked that question. What's the do-over situation? I can't really think of it. I'm sure there were some, but you know, like a typical entrepreneur, you tend to look on the bright side of life, or you try to. So if there were any negatives, I'm sure I've forgotten about them. So I can't think of any, do-overs. The team I had around me, I'm talking about the executives that I worked with, were wonderful people, many of them from small towns with good values and hardworking. And maybe if I could do something over again, I would try and have a better relationship with the media. I wasn't prepared for that aspect of life in the spotlight. To me, it was a great moment to win a Stanley Cup, to win an NHL franchise for my hometown of Ottawa, but I didn't really expect that I would get up in the morning and I was going to go for a jog and I'd find a media guy going through our garbage, looking for, I don't know, notes, letters, whatever, I just didn't expect that. I didn't expect people to follow me, drive around, see what I was doing, who I was meeting. That intrusiveness into a personal life, and a guy like me who's been pretty private, that's quite intrusive. And I didn't expect the impact on my family either, because for me, I did get used to it and I could kind of shrug it off. But I know my mother-in-law, my wife, my kids, I have 5 kids, there were some negative things in the press, it would affect them. And through them, it would affect me.